started. All right. Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to the Public Legal Education Association of Canada, or PLEAC's Virtual Fair. We are on day 2. We had our day 1 sessions yesterday, so for those of you who joined in, thank you so much. Exactly. They were sessions on the digital divide, so we were, hopefully everyone who was able to join sort of enjoyed those sessions yesterday. In case this is your first time though joining the virtual fair, my name is Hannah Holmes. I'm the program director at PLEAC. So it's wonderful to have you all here today as we come together to share knowledge and ideas, and in particular today explore the topic of community justice help, keeping community front and center. We are incredibly grateful to all of our moderators, our panelists, and participants for making this event possible. To all of you, thank you so much for being here and for the important work that you all do in your communities. We're really looking forward to continuing a great event. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that while we are meeting virtually from across the country, I am joining you from Toronto, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land has been home to diverse Indigenous nations for thousands of years and remains home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. So as an organization committed to justice and education, we recognize the ongoing impacts of colonization and affirm our responsibility to work toward truth, reconciliation, and meaningful action as well. So today and tomorrow are the 2 days left of our virtual fair. Similar to yesterday, there will be a 30-minute break from about 1:15 to 1:45. That's Eastern Standard Time. So if you're in a different time zone, I won't list them all off, but hopefully that's helpful just to know that there's about 30 minutes in between sessions today to give everyone a chance to step away, grab a coffee, reflect, or connect informally. We encourage you to use the chat and Q&A function throughout the event to share comments, ask questions, and engage with one another. But we, of course, made sure to leave enough time for questions for our wonderful speakers in both of our sessions today as well. So we'll do our best to get to all of those. And then please don't forget as well to answer the survey at the end of each session. We welcome any feedback to help improve our future events. You'll see a little pop-up, or it might be sent around in an email afterwards as well for folks to complete. Okay, so with that, we have our first session today titled Learning from Initiatives in Other Jurisdictions. I'm very happy to introduce you to our moderator today, Julie Matthews, public legal education researcher, and pass it over to Julie to introduce our wonderful speakers today and get started with our session. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks everyone who's participating in this webinar today. It will, we hope, give you the opportunity to hear from community justice leaders in, as Hannah said, in 2 other jurisdictions, namely the US and the UK. Tara and Antonio are both doing innovative and collaborative work that I think can inform our thinking and efforts here in Canada. And I'm so thrilled to be moderating this session. So we will first hear from Dr. Tara Mulqueen about the research she's been conducting over the last many years. Tara is an associate professor at the School of Law at the University of Warwick in England. And Tara will present for about 20 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A time for a few minutes. We will then hear from Antonio Coronado about community justice-based programs that have emerged in several states in the US. Antonio is a professor of practice at the University of Arizona and the community legal education lead for Innovation for Justice, an initiative housed at the University of Arizona and the University of Utah. In this part of the webinar, I will be asking Antonio a few questions in an effort to draw them out on several issues. When we're finished, we will again open the floor to questions from you participants. So with that short introduction, over to you, Tara.
Thanks so much, Julie. I have some slides, so I'm just gonna quickly share my screen. Can everybody see that? Yes, okay, good, nodding, excellent. Okay, so firstly, thank you for the introduction, and thank you so much for having me today, Julie. And thank you to yourself and to Lois, who I believe is in the audience, for your support and guidance on this project. We couldn't have got through it without you. And we learned a lot. I know I'm here to share from the UK, but we learned a lot from Canada as well in designing this project and thinking about the way forward, particularly the role of trusted intermediaries, which is what I'll be talking about a little bit more today. So I want to just give you, so this was a study, a qualitative study of legal need that we conducted in partnership and collaboration with the Central England Law Centre, which is the largest law centre in the UK, so not-for-profit legal services, and Advice Now, which is a national public legal education provider. It's sort of the foremost public legal education organisation in the UK, together with Warwick and my sort of clinical programme there. So I want to give you guys a little bit of, sorry, it doesn't want to change, I apologize. Has that changed? Good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tara,
Great.
I think just in case, I think it's on sort of the speaker view, if that's okay with you. Just wanted to let you know that's what it looks like.
That's fine. That's great.
Okay, perfect.
Yep. So just a little bit about the study itself. So it is a legal needs study, but we tried to take a slightly different approach based on the kinds of problems that we're facing in the UK at the moment, which I think kind of demand a slightly different understanding of legal need. So just to say, so Coventry is a post-industrial city with the forms of inequality that you might expect in that context. So service-based economy, lots of precarious jobs, lots of money that goes out of the city, but doesn't necessarily get to stay there. So really sort of entrenched forms of inequality. Alongside that, in the UK, we've had sort of a prolonged program of austerity, which has involved really significant cuts to legal aid, which has in many ways sort of decimated the sector. And there have been some opportunities that have arisen from that, but the sort of standard, the provision that was there has decreased considerably. So in Coventry, legal aid provision has decreased by about 70% since 2010. There were problems before that as well, but just the effect of this recent round of cuts has been pretty devastating. On top of that, the context for the study is also the pandemic and the cost of living crisis that we've had here, which has just put obviously intense pressure on individuals, households, organizations, all of the above. In that context, our study is really designed to support the Central England Law Centre's rights and community strategy, which is about sort of emphasizing alternative approaches to providing legal services. So having traditional advice and representation, but recognizing that that's not enough and that we'll never have enough really of that form of resource for individual advice and representation, and that there needs to be work with community organizations, trusted intermediaries, and forms of education alongside that. So kind of going back to some of the earlier things from the 70s that were a more prominent part of the movement here. So in order to inform that, we wanted to work really closely with community organizations in Coventry and really try to see what they're seeing and understand what they're doing in a little bit more detail and to really hear from them. So we collaborated with 7 organizations in Coventry who, broadly speaking, support people from marginalized groups. And so they do things like providing emergency food, supporting homeless youth. They provide mental health support for migrants and refugees, of which there are many in Coventry in particular, and support for women, particularly women subject to sexual exploitation, and women sort of experiencing poverty more generally. So we did 2 kind of main things. One was a group interview with their staff and stakeholders. And then we asked each organization to choose 5 to 7 people that they knew had struggled to deal with law-related problems within the kind of time frame that we were looking at. So we were interested both in kind of who they would identify, but also recognizing that they would sort of know best about who had been struggling. And that was the experience that we wanted to see, but what does it look like to struggle? We know that so many people are struggling, and to really dive into depth about that. And just to say, the people that we interviewed individually, it's a really diverse kind of intersecting identities and experiences, including kind of diversities of race and gender, age, but quite prominently across the groups that we interviewed, a lot of kind of disability, ill health, mental health, and sort of common experience of just poverty and being very low income. Also, our study was really informed by legal consciousness as a sort of approach at focusing on people's narratives. So, really trying to prioritize kind of how they frame and understand their experiences and what's meaningful to them, but also a sort of set of skills and forms of knowledge that we might associate with legal capability, which I'll come back to in a little bit more detail, as two kind of poles that we were considering. So just to say a little bit about what the intermediaries told us initially, they offered a lot of insight about their role and how they understand it, and how they kind of go alongside the people that they support to the extent that they can in order to help them with the problems they face. So they had a lot of observations about sort of local services in general, and how overstretched everything is and how much of that burden seems to fall to them. The long delays that arise when they're trying to support people or they see people going through processes, as well as kind of stigma and really hostile service cultures that people are coming up against when they're trying to access basic entitlements. In terms of the kind of support that they offer, it varied considerably, and the organizations are really quite different in terms of the types of services they provide and how kind of narrow or sort of holistic their service remits might be, and the kinds of support they offered really corresponded with that. But they all seem to recognize, that they had a role in identifying legal needs and offering practical support beyond just sort of signposting and referral. So seem to see themselves as playing a really important role in that. They also identified for themselves some really key tensions in doing that. So just to mention a few, so capacity and funding, that how much they can do comes down to their capacity and whether or not they're funded to do something. And there's a lot of examples of them going beyond service remits and going above and beyond to try to offer help, often beyond kind of to what they felt comfortable doing. Really concerned that they're just stuck filling gaps left by statutory services and the underfunding of legal and advice services. And ultimately also being concerned about having nowhere to send people for advice. So, in many instances, even though Coventry is relatively well provided for, there being nowhere to send people, even once they have kind of identified an issue and maybe taken some initial practical steps. So I just want to say a bit about some of our findings from the individuals more broadly before going back to kind of how people sort of engage with intermediaries in particular. So just to say, what we found in speaking to people and hearing their stories and then kind of sifting through that and trying to identify, the kinds of legal problems that they had faced was just how many of them. So in a period of kind of 30 to 36 months, depending on when we interviewed them, people had somewhere between 4 and 6 problems, sometimes more, sometimes less, but far more than you would get for like a population-wide study and how many you would expect to see. So just a lot of problems. So we interviewed 35 people, and I think we're up to now 140 problems sort of across them in that time frame. These related to kind of broadly sort of loss of income, whether that was a kind of benefits problem or employment discrimination, and the kinds of problems that then follow on from that. Sometimes a kind of cluster of family problems related to often a kind of more immediate or even much earlier experience of domestic violence and then the things that might flow from that, as well as a kind of range of problems that were complicated and sometimes caused by issues with people's immigration status. So those were the kind of 3 main areas that we identified. And the way that they talked about these experiences, they were often kind of situated in relation to their experiences of kind of financial precarity and poverty and what was happening in their lives in that way, changes in their health, as well as things like kind of family breakdown, which could be kind of immediate or sometime in the past. And this was a really important thing in terms of those narratives that I think is, so the study is in some ways focused on kind of the idea of early intervention, but one of the most immediate things that came across really is that it's really hard to figure out what early is. And I think people's narratives really underpinned that, in talking about where those problems come from, the starting point for something can be much, much earlier, 20 years ago even. And it kind of makes you look at the deeper structural causes of the kinds of legal issues and the vast number of legal issues that they're facing. In addition, what came out really strongly from their narratives wasn't just kind of legal problems happening for whatever reason, but a lot of the systemic things, the issues and barriers that perpetuate and often cause legal needs. So for us in particular, and this will be familiar to anyone kind of familiar maybe perhaps with the benefit system in the UK, there were a lot of problems actually caused by sort of maladministration in those systems. So somebody could, have an issue with their benefits, resolve it, be doing well, and then just there would be some kind of mess up with their benefits, which would mean that they're without income for several months before it gets resolved. And then that causes the knock-on problems to housing, leading to homelessness, etc. And so it really kind of pulls attention from just individual circumstances to the wider systemic causes, which I think is really important for kind of community justice initiatives and what we decide collectively to do about these kinds of problems. But also it sounds like you were talking about digital things yesterday, and digital exclusion was obviously a kind of big factor in people's experiences of problems. And a lot of problems emerging are being exacerbated by people's kind of limited resources for engaging with increasingly digitized online systems that seem to kind of penalize them when they're not able to engage with them or don't have help.
Tara, I'm just going to jump in because there's a quick question in the chat relevant to that slide. Someone's just asking, I missed the reference to the time period during which the study participants experienced the 4 to 6 problems. Can you?
Oh, sorry, 30 to 36 months.
Okay.
So 2.5 to 3 years, I think that is.
Perfect. Thank you.
So one of the other things that we looked at was just how people had responded to those problems. And in many instances, they were unidentified. So we spotted a lot just in the process of doing interviews. So in particular, if somebody was appeared to not be claiming the right number of benefits and that was having knock-on effects for them, or, people had been fired. For example, we had one participant who lost a job because she was pregnant, but just accepted this as normal as opposed to being employment discrimination. So things like that. So, when inaction was quite common, and it often related to just not identifying the problem at all, legal or otherwise. And that was linked to sort of power imbalances, but also being in survival mode and just, trying to find a way to get by rather than thinking about whether it was something that could be challenged. Some people took matters into their own hands, but often with quite a kind of partial understanding of what their entitlements might be, and could find forms of resolution, but often struggled for a long time in pursuing them, or kind of accepted things that were fell short of what they could be entitled to. For those who were able to access legal and advice services, and most people had sought some form of help for at least some of the problems they had faced, but often the help that they got was quite piecemeal. Often if they did access legal and advice services, that could be quite vital, lead to successful outcomes, but this often happened late and reflected them kind of having to go around the houses quite a bit in order to find the help that they needed. And so what we found in general was that the support from intermediaries had been a really key factor in people taking action at all. And those who most readily accessed advice did so with the help of intermediaries rather than having to sort of facilitate that on their own. And just to talk a little bit about the kinds of support that intermediaries had provided, and this isn't the intermediaries telling us, this is individuals telling us that what the role of intermediaries had been and the kind of help they got from organizations. So this is primarily help with kind of benefits and debt problems that seem a little bit more accessible, and sort of housing and homelessness that seemed a little bit more accessible. The sort of women's kind of specialist organizations that were in the study also had provided quite a bit of help around domestic abuse. Importantly, people generally hadn't reached out to those organizations specifically for help with whatever law-related issues they were facing, but that relationship offered an opportunity for those problems to sort of surface and then be supported by the intermediary. So it was kind of having that existing relationship, having that kind of existing sort of trust in some instances that enabled that to happen. Really importantly, for quite a few participants, it was a question of kind of building trust and confidence over time, not just with the intermediary, but importantly, confidence and a sense of like it being worth it to actually try to challenge something. So, whether that was as part of a kind of wider community of people who were engaging with that organization and seeing that some other people had managed to, challenge a problem with their benefits, or, challenge an eviction or something like that. And then also there was a lot of really practical examples of kinds of support that they provided, which I think is an important example of kind of how intermediaries really kind of bolster legal capability. So where people might struggle themselves, there's a lot of different ways in which intermediaries step in. So that could be things like making phone calls and filling out forms, or collecting evidence, reading letters if people don't quite understand all of the jargon that's in front of them, or there might be a language barrier, but also ringing up and negotiating on their behalf. And I think particularly when there isn't always somewhere to refer people to, intermediaries were doing a lot of things like just like ringing up the Department for Work and Pensions to try to sort something out, or ringing someone's landlord to try to sort something out. So really proactive help. So that's just a snapshot of our findings. And as Julie and Lois might say, it's a very long report, so we cover quite a lot in there. But just to give you a little bit, that's kind of the sort of things that we were finding. What we've drawn from this, I'll just kind of go through a couple of key points. So I think it's really important to recognize that the experiences that we heard about were not exceptional, and that they are what the intermediaries in our study see on a day-to-day basis. We asked them to choose people who were sort of typical of what they see, and that's what they did. So, they told us about cases that were much worse, but those individuals might have been not in the best position to be interviewed. It wouldn't have been ethical. So we heard secondhand about some of those stories, but, the individuals they chose really, I think, represent for them just what they see on a day-to-day basis. So it's not exceptional at all. And so recognizing, I think from the perspective of early intervention, that again, it really is hard to locate early somewhere meaningful amongst these communities that, people are often already in crisis or experiencing the consequences of kind of unresolved issues as they're engaging with various sources of help in their community, whether that's kind of organizations and intermediaries, statutory services, etc. And then often then people are navigating these sources of help without these issues ever being spotted, sometimes for years. In the UK, we could talk about how this compares with Canada. Community organizations, trusted intermediaries are not typically seen as part of a kind of ecosystem of access to justice. There's a little like sort of a blind spot there, with some notable exceptions. But I think what the research makes really clear is that they already do, irrespective of whether anyone has asked them or told them to do that by virtue of their position, they already play a significant role. And it's just that we haven't recognized it. And in addition, I think it really sort of challenges how we think about what legal need is and also how you respond to it. So I think the kind of conventional thing is like, you have a legal problem, you need some kind of legal help. But I think when you kind of incorporate what intermediaries do and what they bring, is that we see that like legal problems are not just kind of legal problems, that they're quite complex social problems. And it's not just that people have other needs that the intermediaries can meet, it's that responding to a law-related problem requires, a lot of social support in order to do that. So whether that's, acquiring knowledge or skills or just kind of emotional support from people around you, all of it is just as important, I think, as having kind of advice or representation or whatever it might be in the case. So, but what we found amongst the intermediaries was that, there were a lot of really kind of effective practices, things that we saw that worked really well for our participants, and things that kind of fit well for the intermediaries in terms of what they were doing. But ultimately, it was quite ad hoc. So, only about half of our participants had been kind of helped by the organizations in a direct way to deal with the issues that they found. And it often came down to, who they were talking to on the day, what kinds of, what capacity that person had, if they happened to know something about that issue. And so it was really sort of hit and miss in terms of who had been supported in that way, and kind of how well they had been supported, which isn't a judgment of the intermediaries themselves, but just an observation of what was happening, and a kind of inconsistency in how they were able to help people. What we've kind of done with this and this set of findings, and we really want to sort of point to a kind of way forward in terms of thinking about a wider ecosystem of access to justice that isn't just legal and advice services, is to basically say that, early intervention isn't really about kind of early in the sense of preventing problems, although that might be a kind of positive outcome of being able to do this effectively, but basically intervening at the earliest opportunity, at recognizing that there are so many missed opportunities for identifying these problems and offering help and support for people to deal with them and receive their full entitlements or maintain their housing or whatever it may be. And so it's kind of, I mean, for me anyway, sort of asking the question of like, why as a wider kind of community and society aren't more of us able to do this, you know, so that if someone's going to a food bank or going to the local authority for help, you know, local government, that this isn't a kind of more kind of forward approach, and thinking about that as a kind of general problem at a kind of community level and beyond. So just to very quickly before I finish, so I always go massively over time when talking about this, and for once I think I've nearly stayed within it. So our recommendations coming from the research focus on a couple of key things. So one is, of course, like reducing the systemic drivers of legal need, which, you know, we really need government to pay attention to. The way in which the benefit system itself is perpetuating to a really significant degree, it seems to me, legal needs. Developing that wider ecosystem and kind of recognizing the role of different forms of support. Thinking about kind of collaborative local rights-based cultures, and that in particular kind of devising sort of what that ecosystem looks like needs to be a local question, as well as a national one, but that ultimately like it needs to be sort of local actors, like looking at what resources they have between them, making decisions about what that should look like in collaboration with their community. And also I think building community legal capabilities. So I think one of the kind of key sort of criticisms that there's been of the idea of legal capability is that it can be incredibly individualizing. And I think what, for me anyway, one of the key takeaways from this is that it's never an individual question. It is always a question about the kind of wider capability and resources within a community. So I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more and what we think that might look like, but I'll stop there because I think I'm over my 20 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was great. That was great. Even though I have read your draft report, I learned a lot, and thank you for preparing and speaking to this group today. I'm hoping people have questions so that I don't have to have questions that I have not yet had a chance to ask Tara. I can talk to her another time. So please put your questions in the chat or the chat, or I don't see questions here, but we'll give you a couple minutes to think of them, but
there's one in the Q&A here.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you speak more about what you mean by building community legal capability?
Yes. So, I mean, so I think one thing is to make, how to articulate this? So I think some of the really complex decisions around how to support someone if they have a law-related issue sort of need to be simplified. So if we found that it's really ad hoc in terms of how various community organizations and individuals within those organizations make those decisions. But I think one key aspect of that is, to the extent possible, trying to, I feel like standardize is not the right word, but take some of the mystery and guesswork out of it, and making the information and guidance to support those decisions much more readily available, whether through kind of regular programs of training for new staff. There's lots of challenges in doing this, obviously, but and devising the kind of tools that people can use on a sort of day-to-day basis when confronted with one of these issues, and recognizing that within that, organizations are never going to have the same approach. So an organization with a really specific service remit isn't going to be wanting to do people's benefits applications, and that's absolutely fine. I think for us, the takeaway is that whatever they're doing, we just want that to be a kind of informed choice based on the resources that are available, their capacity, that individual's capacity, and how much they might be able to cope with on their own, and what other support they have, so that can all be kind of taken into account when they're deciding in that moment what to do to help that person. And so that for the individuals themselves, they're getting something a little bit more consistent and not just a matter of luck of where they rocked up to that day. I also think at a kind of individual level, it has, well, in terms of supporting individuals, it has like implications for how kind of various services, but particularly legal and advice services, interact with individuals. So for a lot of the people in our study, some of them had really good experiences getting advice or interacting with lawyers. For many of them, and this won't be surprising, it's not a new critique at all, that was an extension of what they had experienced before. And so, they felt quite alienated by that experience. They didn't know what was happening in their cases. They were completely in the dark. And so I think, like, if we're talking about community legal capability, it has to be about kind of shifting those approaches as well, and ensuring that kind of people have a little bit more participation in in what's happening. So those are just maybe two examples. I could probably pull out a little bit more.
Well, a related question is, when thinking about training for trusted intermediaries, do we want to develop their general legal knowledge, or are we better to focus on smaller scale specific things that relate to the work they do day to day, which is a little bit related to what you were just talking about, Tara? Yeah.
I mean, I feel like my sense is that there's a bit of a baseline of knowledge, I think. So what we know is that, like, so it's not just any old legal problems. There's a couple of really key areas that arise really, really frequently. And so I think we could work towards like a kind of baseline, like, so I was just having a meeting today actually with some colleagues about immigration, which is one of the areas that's most difficult, I think, to address in this space. In the UK, it's a criminal offense to give legal advice on immigration if you're not suitably qualified to do so. So people are especially kind of hands-off about it, and there's not that much public legal education about it in general. I was trying to kind of distill with some colleagues, like, if you are in a frontline organization, what should you know about immigration? And it's quite broad level stuff and kind of common myths and misunderstanding, that many of which I think will be particular to the UK system, so I won't go into them. But, like, what would you want someone, speaking to lawyers, working in that kind of role to have some understanding of? And some of that is about just access to legal aid and what it's for, what is and is not available locally, spotting those cases where there are some pathways for real help, and then I think for some of the organizations that we worked with, they really want and need more specialized knowledge. So, some of the organizations work, for example, specifically with people who have experience in the care system. There's a whole kind of host of rights and processes that are kind of relate to people in that circumstance. And so there's a role there for them to do something a little bit more specialized. But I think there is a kind of baseline that we could talk about and try to establish.
Okay, thank you. So, and then just a quick follow-up, and then we'll move on to Antonio. So, do you have thoughts, Tara, on, you just talked about sort of, what to focus on, but generally speaking, is it better to focus on legal skills, identifying legal problems, where to go, appropriate sources, rather than legal knowledge when training trusted intermediaries? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think you can fully separate the two. Although, like, my experience has been that, so I'd say skills are probably more important, knowing where to find information rather than kind of trying to front load everyone with lots and lots of detail. And I find, even for me, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm always like really frustrated with myself for including far too much legal detail in the kinds of training sessions that I do, so much so that it just becomes overwhelming and not very helpful. And I think that's what happens, at least in the examples I've seen of kind of when lawyers are doing this sort of training as well. And so I do think kind of some kind of baseline knowledge and kind of sensibility about these things plus skills is probably the right combination. I don't know.
Thank you. Yeah. And okay. Yeah,
Julie,
go ahead, Hannah. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question in the chat?
I think so. I saw a couple there. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just curious, I guess. Yeah, I guess has the McKenzie Friends model been included in the study? And as well as, have criteria for who should be intermediary been developed? For example, background checks, if no funding to cover those costs, how best to address quality assurance? So sort of twofold there.
We have 2 minutes.
Yeah.
McKenzie Friends, no. There are McKenzie Friends, in the UK. It's a model that we have here, but no, they weren't included in the study. This was specifically community organizations with no legal remit whatsoever, in terms of providing advice. And then the criteria. So this is less of a concern in the UK because the provision of legal advice is not a kind of protected activity. It's not reserved to lawyers. So we don't have quite the same concern. But also, I think for me, it's not so much about who should be an intermediary. It's recognizing that they already are and they're already doing all of this, whether, so it's about kind of supporting them to do it well, as opposed to we don't really have a say in kind of who does it and who doesn't. But kind of bringing up the kind of whole community in a sense to be able to do it well.
And there's a research that maybe a question relating to what surprised you most about your research, and why don't we save that for the Q&A at the end, and we'll move to Antonio.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, Tara. That was, I think people have a lot more to talk to you about, but we'll punt it for a few minutes and move to Antonio, who's been a leader in the emergence of the community-based justice worker programs in the U.S. And Antonio and I decided to do this part of the session more informally through a conversation. So I will be asking Antonio several questions. So I hope to hear a lot from him, and I hope to say very little. So Antonio, you were instrumental in the development of community-based justice worker programs in the U.S. and continue to support those programs to thrive. Can you start by telling webinar participants about what that movement is, that community-based justice worker movement is, how it started, why it started, and what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. Am I coming through okay for folks still? Awesome. So I already preemptively threw in the chat a link to a webinar series that we recently hosted celebrating our 5 years of community-based justice work in Arizona and Utah. I know I'm not going to be able to do service to that half decade of work, so I wanted to throw it in the chat for folks to watch later. Thank you all so much for this opportunity. It's a real pleasure. Thanks also for the far too generous attribution and intro. To clarify a little bit on my end, I oversee the implementation of our suite of community-based justice worker initiatives in both Arizona and Utah, which has been Herculean, to be clear. But once all of the initiatives are lab validated, that's when they come to my team. So we like to joke we're a lean, mean team of 3 different program administrators based out of Arizona and Utah, who are overseeing the implementation of a suite of a couple different initiatives. But at their core, they are legal skill building courses that train, mentor, and support community-based justice workers who are community-based advocates already to embed free civil legal help in their existing community serving role. So as you can already hear, I wear a lot of hats, but the guiding framework is building the community law school, we like to say. And we're very intentional to kind of ground that in the public legal education and community legal education traditions that come before us. So I'm going to take a step back and explain a little bit more about how we get here, a little bit of that question of why now, why here, why in this way. So as you noted in our intro, I'm at Innovation for Justice, which is a social justice legal innovation lab jointly housed, as you noted, in Arizona and in Utah in the US. And we began doing some deep landscaping and needs assessments right around 2019. And we got limited pilot authorization and jurisdiction-based authorization of an exemption from the unauthorized practice of law restrictions that were in Arizona. So we launched a limited scope pilot for domestic violence and family law focused justice work that would train lay legal advocates at one specific DV shelter, or one specific DV service provider, I should say. And then we scaled from there based on the effectiveness and what we really saw as kind of the flourishing of the work. The Supreme Court of Arizona in the US authorized the expansion statewide in Arizona and then to the housing practice area. So from there, it's kind of been this domino up as we've continued to expand. We started with 2 advocates, and we're very proud to say we now support a network of right around, as of this Monday, 95-ish community-based justice workers across both Arizona and in Utah. I would be remiss if not noting the diversity of justice work across the US. So our work in Arizona really, as I said, kicked off in 2019 in the limited authorization and then expansion. But that was paired with a real period of legal service innovation by the Arizona Supreme Court. So they authorized our program and at the same time authorized alternative business structures around who can own legal practice, certified doc preparers, and legal paraprofessionals. So there was this kind of huge kind of category of work that was happening at that time, and it's really since expanded across the country. Around that same time, Alaska Legal Services Corporation was doing their own landscaping and needs assessment and launched their community justice worker program. There's justice worker programs in Montana, South Carolina, Delaware, and they're under consideration now in California, Texas, and Indiana, among a ton of other commissions that I've been presenting to, speaking to, talking to, as you can imagine, in the past year. But for us, it's very important in crafting my role, my name of this role. I didn't pick community legal education out of a hat. It was very important that we honor and name the rich global movement for legal empowerment, particularly community paralegals and the decades of work that comes before this. So that was a huge piece of the work. We also stood on the shoulders of a robust U.S. tradition for legal help. So court navigators, self-help centers, lay legal and victim advocates, admin advocates, and accredited reps. All of that predates us by decades, right? As we know. And so it was because of all of that movement work that we were able to get to this point of the legal profession saying, let's rethink. So a little bit about the why now. I did want to pull these numbers to have them top of mind for us. I really appreciated Tara's presentation around the justice awareness gap. And when do we realize that there's a legal problem? So the Legal Services Corporation in the US around 2022 found that low-income Americans didn't receive any or enough legal help for 93 of all of their civil legal problems. And that number was 92%, sorry, flip that, 92% for problems that substantially impacted them. So this crisis is monumental, right? We know that. That's paired, though, with a regulatory regime in which, according to the American Bar Association, as of 2023, 2/3 of US states have designated unauthorized practice of law as a criminal misdemeanor. So there's a lot of, developments. The movement is building, is what I'm trying to say. The momentum is there, but we are up against this patchwork in each state because each state designates its own civil and criminal designations of unauthorized practice of law. So how is it happening? Where is it happening? It's happening because of place-based and power-conscious legal advocacy.
So interesting. So are these community-based justice workers, are they a new category now of licensed legal professionals? And a related question is, how are they different from community workers or social workers that have given law-related help as part of their services?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. So it's a yes and a no. So it's new in the sense of authorization from each state's respective regulator, in which regulators came to the table and realized justice making cannot be the sole province of lawyers. We have to rethink who justice making is for and who it serves. So that piece is what's new. We know, as I was kind of giving that full alphabet soup of all of the many folks that were already doing this amazing community help or in community helping roles, what we've done is we've worked in both Arizona and in Utah to change the unauthorized practice of law regulations to get out of the way of the community help that was already happening, to ensure that they're able to embed legal help and legal aid into the existing work they're already doing. And the lived experience experts like direct service providers, community organizers, faith leaders, frontline staff, they're closest to the legal harms or to the legal outcomes that from our systems. And so they should be closest and centered in the solution making. So it's a yes and a no, and that the new piece is they've received state authorization to embed trained, mentored legal care into their human and social service care.
Right, thank you. Yeah. Okay. So as you know, numerous community workers in Canada at frontline agencies also help people with their housing, income support, settlement, and other sort of basic human needs. And they, like in Utah and Arizona, provide wraparound support. So are these are the types of workers that are trained and supported as community-based justice community-based justice workers in Utah and Arizona? Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm going to pair it with some of the questions we're getting in the chat. So
Okay.
yes,
Okay.
we enroll in Arizona and Utah frontline staff from governmental, legal, nonprofit, and human social service sectors. This includes community action agencies, governmental departments, nonprofits, DV housing shelters, grassroots organizations, chapters of national orgs. So each state across the US differs in its regulatory structure, as I'll talk a little bit, I imagine, later. But the positions are not new positions. They're the existing positions at a social service or human service organization, where legal services are embedded into their role and their roles are restructured so that they are able to then embed legal care at the same time that they're giving social human service care. I know that was one of the questions around kind of where are these roles? How does this happen? And I know the other question is how this ended up before the court. So I'll quickly say, and then we'll probably talk about this a little later, but because the Supreme Courts of Arizona and Utah are the regulators of the practice of law in both states.
So on a related question, Antonio, so what are these community-based justice workers authorized to do now that they weren't able to do before?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this dovetails nicely with the presentation we started with.
Yeah.
They're able to provide upstream, right size, and preventative legal care. So in Arizona and Utah, we have authorization to train and certify or launch folks. I'll explain that why I say or in a second. But in three civil legal practice areas. So we have housing stability and eviction defense, domestic violence and family law matters, and medical debt advocacy. In Arizona, we're very proud. I'm going to do a virtual drum roll here to say that in the next month or so, we'll soon be authorized to train and launch folks in a wider category of civil legal practice areas. But folks can provide free legal services from intake all the way through post-proceeding support. So they're able to triage an issue spot. They can identify when an issue is beyond scope for referral to a legal aid attorney. And it helps eliminate that revolving door that we know, right? All too well, folks are moving from social service org to social service org. It embeds the legal help where they're turning first, as far upstream as we can get. And it avoids re-traumatization of folks having to retell or recount their testimony and story of what is for so many people the worst point of their life. And it centers those closest, as I've already noted, to the impacts of the system in kind of problem solving, really far upstream. An eviction hasn't even been filed yet, but based on the story you've shared with me, you might have a housing problem. You're here at the DV shelter or you're here at the DV service provider, but we need to talk about the lease. We need to talk about housing. We need to talk about all these other pieces that in the past they would not have been able to do in terms of advice as it relates to a different civil justice problem.
Or if they were doing it, they certainly weren't doing it openly and with huge comfort, right? I mean, our research would suggest it's happening, but probably sort of under the radar if they can keep it that way. Okay, and you sort of have touched on this, but maybe can you tell us more about what training, mentorship, support do the workers receive to do this work? How often, and what is the content? And does the model differ between the states in which you work?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. So yes, it varies between the states we work in, and it varies across programs across the US. So we at i4j enroll folks in free, online, and self-paced around 60 to 80-hour legal empowerment courses. We say 60 to 80 hours-ish because some folks it takes way shorter, some folks it takes way longer, because they're embedding this into their existing role. So some folks might be doing this during their work hours. They might have an arrangement where they're doing it during a specific shift of their existing position. But all courses start with an onboarding to community legal education to say hello, welcome as a new category of legal professional. This is your role in justice making. It's a double layer of, folks might be learning the law for the first time in this kind of way. They might be learning online for the first time in this kind of way. So we seek to ground all of our courses in adult educational best practices and andragogy. But every single course starts with a required module on trauma-informed advocacy and legal advocacy, what that means for their new role as a legal professional. Woven throughout all of the modules, there are racial, procedural, disability, and distributive justice considerations for what it means to be an intersectional legal advocate. Experiential learning is front and center through real-time practice sessions, synchronous practice sessions, and in-court observation assignments. And then our curricula, which I touched on a little bit at the beginning, is community responsive. So I'm very proud to say we don't do anything, we don't launch anything unless community has approved it and that it's built by, with, and for those who will be taking the training. So we pivot real time, semester by semester. We train typically fall and spring on a university-ish kind of calendar. But we pivot. If a particular assignment doesn't land with a cohort of folks we're training because it turns out that the median age is different or the cultural context is different, we change, right? We adapt as any good educator would. Um, but the curriculum, as I've kind of noted, over the course of the years was developed initially by stakeholders and system actors, including the regulators themselves, potential community-based advocates who would be going through the program, the service providers who might be enrolling folks, as well as survivors and tenants who would be receiving these services. What kind of curriculum do they, need folks trained in to support them? Once they've gone through this training, they are paired with an attorney mentor who gives them real-time support in kind of identifying when is this beyond your scope, when do you need to refer, and then we have regular roundtables for continuing education upon their launch. We collect data regularly throughout that process. In Arizona, there is a test and a certification mechanism once they launch and finish our course. And in Utah, the regulation is really delegated to the org and to our training. So there's no test, there's no certification. Once they've gotten through that initial, I assume we'll talk a little bit later how it differs, but once they've gotten through that initial application hurdle, they trust the training to say, you are trained, you are ready to go.
I was saying wow, wow, but I had my microphone. Okay, well, in practice, do community organizations have to be authorized to give these legal services, or does each worker have to seek authorization? And I have a couple of related questions if you don't address them. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So this depends on the state. It's a both and. So in Utah, there is a regulatory sandbox in which any entity that wishes to enter the sandbox has to apply for entity level authorization by the regulators, which is jointly housed by the State Bar and the Supreme Court. Within the sandbox, our organization has partnered with Community Justice Advocates of Utah, which is serving as the regulatory hub for training folks. So community partners can then train through our partner organization instead of having to apply every single time to participate. So it's a hub and spoke in which we're able to kind of democratize and decentralize some of that process. In Arizona, organizations apply to be an approved legal service organization. So that's an initial kind of application where they can say, what kind of services are you giving now? Do you have the support systems to support folks through intake? Is there a system set up so that from a public consumer perspective, if someone wanted to file a complaint with your organization, how would they even do that? Do you have a website? Those kind of questions, right, as the regulator. Then, once they've gone through our training, advocates in Arizona take a test that's a 90-minute, 50-question multiple choice exam. They apply for certification and they're certified. And then they're able to go to any approved organization. So if they leave the DV shelter that they're authorized at, they can go to another partner org that's already approved within this network. And we're constantly helping folks apply and expand that network. So open goal is to build that.
Well, so Antonio, is there a limited number of community-based justice workers, or is somebody trying to keep a cap on it? And what is happening to the community workers who have been giving this help all along? Are they continuing to provide law-related support, or are they being held back?
Yeah, great questions. So I'll take the first one. There's no limit. So we're very proud to say in Arizona and Utah, the sky is the limit. At this point, it's whatever our team can do in the 9 to 5 building the community law school and our 5 to 9 of the paperwork. So there's no limit. Where the real goal, and I'll move now to the second one, is to supercharge the state's legal ecosystems the best we can. So any panel, convening, paper, publication I'm part of, I do make a point to note something that I think so many folks take for granted, which is that I'm from Arizona. I'm from the desert. I know what a desert is. We don't have legal deserts. I'm very intentional to call them legal vacuums. That the law has been taken from a place, right? That it's been sucked out, that there is a disempowering that's happening. So I think to your second question, something that we try to be very intentional about is the same folks that we connected with during the design phase, they're the first round applicants. They're the folks that we stay in contact with throughout. So that whether they are community-based advocates, trusted intermediaries, lay advocates, however they might self-identify, we are very intentional to keep those relationships, to identify their interest and eligibility for participating, as well as how we can amplify the work that they're already doing. The other piece of this is that, particularly in Arizona, the push continues to be to get any and all services out there. So we see it as a both and, right? So whether it's a right to counsel kind of movement, whether it's our community-based justice worker movement, we see all of this as filling the ecosystem. I want to uplift that in Arizona, we rank 5th last for legal aid attorneys in the US per residence below the poverty line, and second to last for all lawyers, period, in the US. So it's really a stark reality in which we work. So for us, it's always and.
We're getting lots of questions. Can you just quickly, I'll interject with a couple and then maybe we'll save the rest to the end. So remind us what types of legal services are provided in Arizona by the community-based justice workers, please.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in Arizona in particular, right now, they are doing domestic violence family law and housing stability eviction. In Utah, it's housing stability eviction and medical debt legal advocacy. In Arizona, we have been expanded to go, as I shared, to a broader range of civil legal practice areas, which will include consumer issues, so like medical debt, but also SNAP benefits. I want to say trust and wills are in there as well, administrative hearings. So it's a broader category now.
Right, right. And quickly, how are these programs funded?
Yeah,
Well,
so
maybe not so quickly, but whatever.
yeah, no, I'll tease that out. So it's a combination of different things. So the funding of the organizations is their existing role. The funding of our organization has come from in Utah, the Utah Bar Foundation. And in Arizona, it's a combination of our university supporting us. It's a combination of independent private funding, and a combination of social justice funding or social justice-based grants.
Great. Okay, and two more questions, and then we'll go back to sort of general questions from the audience. So what kind of data are you collecting on these programs? Have there been complaints about the services of community-based justice workers and being bad types of help or incorrect assistance?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to pull up some numbers here that I have.
And while you do that, I mean, my related question was, how does that track record, assuming you're going to speak to it, provided by community-based justice workers compare with complaints made about the services of lawyers or other licensed legal professionals in those states, if you have that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to take each of them piece by piece.
Right.
So in Utah, the regulatory sandbox requires high-level service information on a monthly basis. So they are very interested in what kinds of services are provided, how many services. It's very high level in that way. In both states, Innovation for Justice and my team are collecting data that on more in-depth legal and financial outcomes associated with the services, as well as client level data. So we could see real time, what are the demographics of the folks that are being served. In Arizona right now, it'll soon be in both states. I'm super interested, and I think it's really important to track justice worker self-efficacy and their own level of reported self-confidence in providing limited scope legal practice without direct supervision of an attorney. So that is something that we're building in. We're very proud to say zero consumer complaints in our 5 years of operations and 4 years of services. Separate from that zero, though, I think we all know in some way, shape, or form, whether in our respective jurisdictions, that this kind of work, justice work or trusted intermediaries or community paralegals, are always under a microscope, right? I'm going to fight the hypo a bit and say that I think the attorney comparison might be the wrong metric, and that the comparison is truly folks who get zero legal help. It's not necessarily whether it's an attorney, it's they're not getting any legal help at all. It's 92 to 93%.
Mhm.
And so we also know from traditional lawyering that it's not working. So I do question sometimes whether data is the problem as so much as our unwillingness to envision community legal power in the first place.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Um, Okay, so my last question, which gets a little bit into the regulatory sphere, but so as you know, we've discussed this, Antonio, with few exceptions, legal regulators in Canadian provinces and territories prohibit anyone who is not a licensed legal professional from providing legal services or engaging in the practice of law as broadly defined by those regulators. And research confirms that community organizations worry that the assistance they provide, the law-related assistance they provide, may be viewed as legal advice or legal services, and that they could be investigated for the unauthorized practice of law. What has been the response in the US, in the states you've been working in, to the community-based justice worker movement and to regulatory reform on the whole?
Yeah, I love that question. So I'll say it's been an initial mixed response. I mean, we've been doing this now in this way for 5 years, so that's changed significantly, even year by year. But the movement and the broader shift at the state levels is changing the tide. I think there continues to be, and there has been historically, a confusion of roles or limits of our legal imagination. So the minute someone's not a lawyer in the US, and even the term non-lawyer, I think becomes a sticking point, right? Of like, how are we defining folks by their power and the work that they do beyond not being something? So challenging that and saying that, I think that continues to be something we grapple with in supporting our advocates. So we do regular judicial education and bench education so that they know who's appearing before their courts. And so I do think that's the main sticking point, that the lawyer is not supreme, and so that's confusing for folks. Something that we are very intentional to do, though, in our approach is involving all system actors across the launch of the work. So I mean to say that when we connect with members of the state bar or the organized profession who are maybe skeptical, who maybe have concerns, my response is always, thank you. I really appreciate that. We would love to have you be an attorney mentor. We would love to have you be a content creator for the course. Please, let us know. Help us develop all of the resources you think folks might not get right. So that's kind of been how we respond to me.
Closing in an ideal world, what do you think is the role of a legal regulator vis-a-vis justice-related services provided by on the ground community workers in a not-for-profit setting? Yeah.
Yeah, that's another good question. So, I mean, I think something that we embody in our design hub approach at Innovation for Justice is seeking to be an inclusive kind of center of gravity for reimagining legal service innovations. So we don't do any project without centering historically excluded and systemically disinvested communities. Because again, as I noted at the beginning, folks that are closest to the harms need to be the ones leading in developing the solutions. So I really think the goal, if I leave on any kind of last kind of notes here, I think the goal is getting traditional legal barriers out of the way to follow community leadership, to imagine a robust and democratized legal ecosystem. So I want to leave folks with two potential questions. I mean, I know we'll have other questions, but two potential questions and ask, maybe breathing, gathering ourselves where we might be zooming in from. What does it look like to receive legal care in the places we already turn? And what does it look like to imagine, or to reimagine, I should say, not just re-regulate justice making? That's, I think, what guides me in this work and kind of what the future role of all of us could be.
I love that, Antonio. Yeah, and I will ponder that at 3 o'clock this afternoon over a cup of tea. Thank you very much. Such interesting programs. And I love the supercharging the justice ecosystem, which was something also that Tara talked about in terms of her research and sort of the need to expand and broaden and have a more inclusive justice ecosystem. So we now have, I think, 15 minutes or so, close to 15 minutes for you two to take questions from webinar participants. There have been a couple waiting for you, Antonio. So why don't you, I'll quickly give you one of the first of those. What are the challenges and how do you deal with them in reaching rural remote folks who have legal needs?
Yeah, absolutely. And before anyone leaves, and this is on the recording, I misspoke. Wills and trusts are not in that future anticipated scope. I did include it here in the chat. It'll be DV, specifically orders of protection and family law, evictions, housing instability, public benefits, debt and debt relief, unemployment, and consumer issues. So they tease it out in that way. And then I think to the question of reaching rural and remote. So we're a fully virtual legal innovation lab. We have team members in Arizona. I'm zooming in from Greensboro, North Carolina. We have folks in Texas. We have folks in another part of North Carolina and Georgia and Colorado. So all of that to say, everything we do is remote by nature. So we think that it's actually been a real asset in being fully virtual and online for reaching folks that are in more rural parts of the states in which we work. It allows them to attend virtual trainings and courses without needing to be physically somewhere. Add to it that it's free, and that just ups the ante a little bit. We also do direct in-person outreach. So regularly I am flying and I'm somewhere in the skies between Arizona, Utah, and all the states we work to connect with folks because it's all about relationship building.
And is the training curriculum available publicly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have all of our reports that underlie the proposals available online, which includes an outline of the curriculum. The actual curriculum videos and modules, because it's 80 hours of content and to different extents is proprietary to the attorneys or the law professors who built the content. That is all on the backside for the students. But the modules themselves, including the learning outcomes, the types of materials that be included, all of that is public. And perfect segue to say that we're restructuring our website to soon include kind of a matrix of all of that soon.
And both of you, I think, so Tara, I think you had your email contact information on your last slide, did you? Or did you? Anyway, I think Antonio, if people want to contact you, I think they can find you online, can't they? Or you're going to insert it. I mean, if you're willing for people to be able to do that, if you could, thank you. And Tara, your report you think will be out in some journal in about how long? And then Hannah, maybe we could make sure that PLEAC, shares that information and gives a link to the journal when that article's published. When might that be?
So it should be out in about 2 weeks, and it's a standalone report. So there'll
Right.
be maybe other publications and academic stuff from it, but just
Right.
the report on its own will be out in about 2 weeks.
Right.
Yeah, so
Right.
I'll be sure to share it.
Right. Okay. So other questions? I'll give you a minute before I jump in. Tara, why don't you take a question from Antonio that came up earlier, which is, what surprised you most about your research? Or what did you find that was most surprising when you did your research?
Um, yeah, I've been thinking about that, and I don't know about surprise. Because in part because some of this kind of territory around legal needs and a lot of the kinds of issues that you mentioned as well are kind of things we've known for a long time, like how few people actually get to any kind of legal service, etc. I mean, I don't know that we expected to see quite as many sort of issues as we did. I think at least what's kind of struck me most was just how important the intermediaries were for some people, and in many cases without having any kind of prior training. The people are just trying to figure it out as they go in an environment where there's just not enough support available, and how much they brought to that. Just I think really kind of expanding about like what we think legal help looks like, and what it should look like and where it should be located as well, is probably the most striking thing for me, I think. I feel like these discussions kind of too often get sort of sealed within a kind of justice sector kind of silo, and we forget about sort of wider communities. So even in the UK, where we don't have as many sort of regulatory barriers and things like that, it is still a profession, and there's a lot of norms and kind of cultural things around that mean that we don't really look at the wider community as a resource and as the people who are often doing the work really on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's it. I actually have a question for Antonio as well. So I loved everything that you had to say. Sorry, I was just like all these things that I wanted to, like, been trying and struggling to say, just so beautifully articulated. And I wondered how you navigate. I really appreciate the kind of the buy-in for in your curriculum design. And I wondered how you navigate tensions around. So I've been trying to sort of do something similar in terms of where this research goes and the kinds of things that we're designing, and find it really difficult, in part because people already think they don't know much about the law. So even if they are doing the work, when it comes to actually explicitly talking about law, they're like, oh, I don't know, and kind of want to be given the information or be led or what have you. And it's not that they don't have views about it, but I think getting, I don't know, kind of trying to facilitate that sort of buy-in for process happening. I wonder if you've kind of, faced any challenges in doing that, or have encountered this problem, and how you've tried to sort of navigate it, or sort of where the buy-in for comes in and kind of balance with, like, the legal knowledge and skills and all of those things that, we can kind of determine are needed in relation to a particular area.
Yeah, absolutely. So to clarify though, the buy-in from the applicant advocates who are going through the training.
Yeah, so sorry, I'd have to kind of go back over notes just to know exactly at what point in the process, but it seemed like they had a really big role in deciding kind of what should be in the curriculum and what they wanted to know more about and all of that. And so kind of how do you facilitate that kind of sort of meaningful participation and engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk about it on both ends. I'll talk about it during design and I'll talk about it during implementation. So during design, we held a series of community workshops with, as I said, the system actors who are either the direct regulators, the advocates themselves who might be prospective participants in these programs, as well as folks who are directly impacted in one way, shape, or form by the civil legal system. And so we do a lot of guided facilitation around, what kind of common issues are you seeing? And so the common top level civil legal needs became both the needs assessment and the curricula in identifying, if you're seeing this specific kind of eviction problem, that needs to be the curricula that we're building. Of course, we make sure to include a broader scope so that they're prepared to triage and refer out. But it's kind of not even reverse engineering, but the engineering in the first place, in the first instance of what a law school should be. That if you're a law school in a jurisdiction who's educating folks to practice maybe in that jurisdiction, why would you not train on the common civil legal problems of that jurisdiction? Instead of maybe in the US, I'll speak specifically to the bar exam or to topics that are grounded in other values. I will save that for another webinar. But for us, it's kind of, flipping it on its head as to how do we even build the curriculum in the first place. So that's the kind of design phase. In implementation, what we do is we do a lot of legal skill building around what I think becomes shorthand as kind of the like miss and disorientation of legal education. And so the like lawyer norms, the inoculation to the profession, we try to break up as fast as possible to say, no, you are a legal professional, even by participating in this program. So let's start there. And how can we help build that confidence in providing the legal advice? So there's a lot of like role playing, turn taking. I come to this work by way of clinical legal education immediately preceding. So experiential participatory learning is a guiding force in the work for sure.
And Antonio, do you want to say something about whether digital divide, digital inclusion, exclusion issues are big concerns in the states that have your programs?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is yes, always yes. One, yes. Two, it maps directly onto what we see as the legal vacuums, right, of where attorneys are available in the first place. And so what we do is if there are organizations that are participating in our programs or wanting to, that are unable to, is we partner them with another participating organization so that there is kind of like a broader network of folks supporting one another. We also kind of build out a internal kind of directory and system for communication for all of the advocates. So if they're supporting a specific tenant or survivor who maybe doesn't have access to resources in the facilitation of that case or the legal support, they're able to refer to one another to this new, totally kind of embedded network beyond attorneys or beyond the limits of the traditional legal profession.
Great. And I think probably a last question, just because I see we're close to time. What sort of, and this again to Antonio, what sort of ongoing support do you provide to the justice workers once they complete the training and they're
So
on the job?
On the job. In addition to partnering them with assigned attorney mentor who provides that kind of real-time support over phone or email as they're working through a specific case, our team also has regular quarterly newsletters with relevant legal developments or law changes in their jurisdiction, upcoming continuing education opportunities, webinars, events that we kind of call the greater internet to find for them. We have individual kind of like newsletter editions or kind of like op-eds that we write of like, hey, here's some considerations for starting your own legal practice in this new way. You're a social or human service organization. You've never had to do legal intake specifically. Here's things to think about. So it's a lot of resource development on the newsletter side. We do monthly meetups virtually with all of the advocates across all of our network. So DV advocates in Southern Arizona and medical debt advocates in Salt Lake County in the middle of Utah are connecting across jurisdictions digitally to share resources. And then we have also monthly community-based organization roundtables for the org leadership and supervisors to kind of hear what are the wins, challenges, and successes.
Wow. Well, I think we need to close, right, Hannah? I sense, yeah. Okay. So before I turn it over to Hannah to do the proper closing, I just want to say thank you so much to Antonio and Tara. Your presentations and the work you're doing, in fact, they're so innovative, so thoughtful, so collaborative. I learned a lot. I'm sure the participants today learned a lot. And thank you so much for your time, your energy, your commitment to community. And Hannah, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, just a few last things before folks come off this. Again, thank you to everyone here for joining us today and echoing all of Julie's sort of positive sentiments here on our speakers. Huge thank you, Tara, Antonio, and Julie. Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for your valuable insights and for driving such an important conversation today. So we really appreciate it. And of course, if you've registered for our next session today, we'll see you back at 1:45. That's Eastern Standard Time, or just in about 30 minutes. If you haven't signed up yet, there's still time. And if you can't make it, we hope to see you tomorrow as well for our final day for the virtual fair, and where we explore specifically the topic of evaluation tomorrow. But today, more community justice work discussions. And again, thank you so much to everyone, and some great feedback in the chat for our panelists today. So thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for coming and participating.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
So
Thank-
much.
Bye.
Thank you.